And joining us now on the debate, Terry Sullivan from Cancer Care Ontario, Michael Wozniak from the National Cancer Institute of Canada, Tak Mack, cancer researcher at the Princess Margaret Hospital, Ruth Greer, former Minister of Health for Ontario and a longtime cancer prevention activist, Robert Buckman, medical oncologist at the Princess Margaret Hospital, and cancer survivor and patient advocate, Beth Kapusta. We got to have the voice of the patient at this table today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this discussion. We all remember in 1971, Richard Nixon declaring a war on cancer. We are almost 4 decades later, and I wonder, Terry, start us off. Give us a snapshot of where we're at in that war in the early part of 2007.
Well, good news is there's been an improvement in survival, major improvements over the course of the last 3 decades. So we see lots of people with major cancers now living for healthy life, living a full and healthy life, disease-free. There are still massive amounts of inactivity in relation to prevention and screening. There's a lot we can do that we're not doing. Fantastic developments in biological science. Tak Mack and colleagues can talk a little bit about this with respect to targeting cancers more precisely.
In fact, let me do that right now. How are we doing as far as you're concerned? A snapshot of where we're at.
I think we're at the turning point where the traditional treatments have hit the wall in terms of buying the number of cures and regression, and we're now into a very exciting era of targeted drugs.
A turning point meaning what? From what to what?
From what I would consider as non-specific treatment, if you really nasty, you could use the word poison, to sharpshooting drugs that we're turning to.
Let me go to the person sitting right beside you, because you've seen all this firsthand. You're 25 when you got cancer for the first time?
That's right.
And then you had a recurrence of it?
I had secondary cancer.
A secondary cancer.
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so a bit of time in between each. Compared to where you were and where you are, how do we look right now in 2007?
Well, it's a much, I think the glass is half full this time around. Major shift in the culture of cancer during those years. Much more emphasis on the patient. We now have a cancer strategy that's been a collaboration between professionals and patients that has led to a much more collaborative spirit about where we are. We're all dealing with what we know to be a huge demographic bubble, but it's in a collaborative way. I think that we've dropped the war metaphor. We're not seeing an emphasis on the cure anymore. We're seeing an emphasis on control, because we know that cancer is over 200 diseases. And the idea of a cure is a kind of simple rhetorical device, but the reality is that cancer is a very complex terrain.
Well, let me put that to Rob Buckman. I saw you give a note of acknowledgement when she said...
Absolutely. I agree with everyone, yes.
But we're not into a war anymore? This is all about control now?
The war was such a dumb analogy. I'm sorry, Mr. Nixon, but it was a dumb analogy. I mean, aiming to put a man on the moon is easy because you can see the moon is right up there. But the idea that that cancer is one disease and we'll declare war on it, rubbish. There are 200 different diseases, as everyone knows. At least 50% of people with any of the 200 cancers will, as one of my patients said, die of something else. There are a whole bunch of them which are serious chronic diseases, and Tak is absolutely right that chemotherapy has done fairly well in a few cancers, moderately well in quite a few other cancers, but it probably isn't going to go that much further than it is now. The future is the biologics, the sharpshooting, the aimed, targeted drugs that are going to hit cancers as opposed to normal cells. That's where we're going.
Michael, from your perch at the National Cancer Institute, what do you see?
It's easy to follow these guys because they've said everything that I would have wanted to say. From a research perspective, I think there's no doubt that we've learned more about what makes a cancer cell probably in the last 2 to 3 decades than we've learned in all time up to there. And I agree with Tak completely. We've gone from the hitting the broad side of the barn door to going in and picking the locks. People think that it's difficult to kill cancer cells. It's not difficult to kill them at all. What's difficult is killing only the cancer cells
Not the healthy ones.
and not the healthy ones. And all of the classic side effects that we think of, hair falling out and getting nauseous and getting anemic, is because those cells are also being killed by the classic chemotherapies. And we're entering an era now where we're going to see much more targeted therapies which really prey on specific characteristics of cancer and not just some generalized phenomenon.
Ruth, I'd be interested in your view on this because I think you were the Minister of Health who appointed the first ever task force specifically to look at cancer and recommendations to government as to what to do.
It was the first ever to look at the primary prevention of cancer, and primary prevention is stopping cancer before it starts. And so I would sort of agree with my friends that in fact we've made huge strides in terms of treatment, but I want to extend the continuum and say we've got to move backwards and begin to look at how do we stop the incidence of cancer from increasing. And that is now on the radar screen, as it wasn't in 1995 when that task force reported. I think the question is going to be, what do we mean by that? How do we define it? Who does it? And where do we get the capacity within our researchers and within our system to make primary prevention, not just screening and secondary prevention, but stopping it before it starts, a real priority?
Well, we have something new now called the Canadian Strategy for Cancer Control, announced not too long ago by the Prime Minister and the Health Minister. Terry, what's that all about?
It's a national strategy. It's been evolving for the last few years, but this is the first time we've got a solid commitment. The Prime Minister announced it. Actually, all three parties in the last election endorsed it. So that means we all assume it's here to stay. It's about $50 million a year for 5 years, and it's focusing on some targeted areas which are really designed to accelerate the application of knowledge in the areas of primary prevention and screening, in the use of guidelines, in the area of supportive care, in surveillance. It's trying to get a coordinated national effort. So it's a modest investment, an important investment in trying to build a coordinated national effort.
Mac, did we need this?
Well, you're putting me on the hot seat. I think we need more basic research to understand what prevention means. Because, look, other than our genes, which we have no control over with respect to our parents, we have 3 big causes of cancer that we can prevent: alcohol, cigarettes, and sunshine. Okay? And then we have these pathogens, viruses and bacteria. We researchers have came to the bottom of it. We have now vaccine against hepatitis B virus for liver cancer. We have vaccine against papillomavirus for cervical cancer, and we're going to get vaccine against H. pylori for gastric cancer. The only thing we've got left is hepatitis C. This is basic research. We're preventing 80% of the cancers. Let's not make it into too big a deal.
Terry wants back in.
I agree with Tech entirely, but I want to add something. Knowing is only half the battle. It's actually the application of the knowledge in the delivery system that's the other half of the battle. So we've got now $300 million for HPV inoculation. How we actually put that in the population will be the real determining factor as to whether there is a real net reduction in cervical cancer in future years, or there is a random walk through the population and the motivated upper middle class families accept the inoculation and everybody else walks away
Rob,
from it.
then Ruth.
I'm strongly in favor of implementation, as Terry said. I mean, we know that smoking causes all these various cancers, the lung and bladder and so on and so on and so on. Now, the real difficulty is we also know that if you start as a girl at 11 years old, start smoking, it's very unlikely that you'll give up early enough. So I would like, if I had $1 billion, Minister, if I had $1 billion, I would like to find out exactly what 11-year-old girls are thinking of. And I would like to, as it were, target the reasons for which 11-year-old girls think that smoking is a cool
Don't we
thing.
know this already? They want to be cool. There's peer pressure. It's all that
Cool
stuff, isn't it?
You are absolutely correct. But how to stop them thinking that smoking is cool does require some serious thought.
Okay.
And I'd like to do it.
I just wanted to get in with respect to what Mac had said, because I'm not sure we do know enough And I think that as an environmentalist, we know that there are a lot of chemicals to which we're all exposed in large or small amounts that have been identified as contributing to cancer. We will never know the cause of a cancer because it's such a multifactorial disease. But we could avoid our involuntary exposure to a lot of substances, and that's where we lack. We lack the researchers, we lack the commitment, and we lack the willingness to regulate in ways that are happening in other jurisdictions. And I think the strategy, the national strategy, which is where you started this question, is a very good beginning because it did a really good survey of best practices on environmental and occupational exposures. I worry that because we are a federal system and implementation in healthcare is so much a provincial responsibility, that while we have the national strategy, we haven't quite figured out how to bring everybody on board and singing from the same hymn book at this point.
Beth and Michael.
Well, I think one of the main attributes of the Canadian strategy is that it is cross-cutting. It's not about innovation, it's about applying what we know. Because there's a lot of untapped potential to improve outcomes and to improve the quality of life of cancer patients. So it's not just about science, it's about a very real world scenario where you say, we can't really solve this problem. Like take human resources as a good example. We can't solve the human resources problem in Ontario unless we know what's happening in the whole country. So we're going to work together on that challenge because it makes more sense to work together than to compete against one
Do you
another.
think that'll happen now? There'll actually be collaboration, cooperation amongst all the different departments across the country?
That's the aspiration. That the strategy is not just a collaboration amongst a few professionals. It has a political line, it has a patient line, and it has a professional line, and all of those things do have to cooperate in order to achieve what they're setting out to do.
Michael?
I'm going to be a little foolhardy and try and see if I can tie some of this together a little bit, because these are not mutually exclusive solitudes by any means. When it comes to prevention, without being sounding facetious, I mean, it's clear the best way to deal with cancer is don't get it. People are often critical about the lack of resources up to now that they perceive has not gone into research into prevention or activities into prevention. And here's where I really do agree with TAC. I mean, the simple premise is you cannot prevent what you don't understand, and I would have no problem defending and justifying all of the sort of basic preclinical molecular discovery kinds of research that Canada has excelled at in order to better understand some of these things. I think we are at a point now where we do have to start applying some of this. And really, the big issue is you can't do everything all at the same time with a finite pot of resources.
Well, let me follow up on this for a second. Rob Buckman, in your old home and native land, overseas the UK, they've had a national cancer strategy since the year 2000.
That's correct.
What kind of success have they had with that?
Tremendous success in visible endpoints. That they have the very strict rules. You've got to be seen by your family practitioner within 2 weeks if a cancer is suspected. The moment the family practitioner says, I think you might have a cancer, you've got to be seen in the hospital within 30 days, and treatment has got to be started within 62 days.
And they hit those targets?
93.5%, and there are big fines. Now, that is very good. We are actually, at the moment, doing better than them. I mean, I'm really quite serious that our mortality, the five-year mortality from the cancers in this country is still better. And that's not actually a vast improvement of Britain, of Canada. It's just that Britain was way behind and is now coming up. And we haven't moved that much further ahead. We're spending, what is about 10% of our GNP.
I got the numbers right here.
Oh, go ahead.
Let me put it up by hand, because the Globe and Mail didn't quite report it as enthusiastically as you just presented it to us here.
They needed to talk to me, I think.
They didn't talk to you. But what they said, here's how Andre Picard of the Globe reported it back in November of 2006. He said, Stephen Harper's government has allocated $260 million over 5 years for a cancer strategy. That pales next to the $4 billion Britain has spent in a similar period. Fair point?
He doesn't measure the size of the hole that they were trying to fill. It's very important. I mean, without disagreeing with Andre Picard, I disagree. That actually, their mortality statistics are still worse. probably because they're partly digging out that hole, partly because they had major unevenness, which they are now trying to repair in the last 6 years. We have some unevenness. We could definitely do better, and I think this actual strategy is actually a good idea if we can give endpoints for this kind of triage. The thing about the cancers, there are 200 different diseases, some really need urgent treatment, but that's very rare, relatively rare. Some could be either way. Some, unfortunately, are probably not going to be fixable. Like, for example, most of the lung cancers, screening, for example, in those is not actually going to make a great deal of difference, whereas screening for bowel cancers will make a great deal of difference indeed. So I think that what we should do is concentrate on trying to get everyone triaged first, so that you're told you've got a symptom that might be something. In your case, it's nothing. In your case, it's something. It doesn't need urgent treatment. It needs treatment soon. That's good money.
We've looked across the pond. Let's look south. And Terry, to that end, I note that the United States has, for the second consecutive year, reported numbers that are going down. Do we know why that's happening? The number of cancer cases, that is.
I don't have a good explanation for why it's happening. I mean, in balance, if you adjust for age and population growth, we're also showing improvements in mortality and survival. So I don't have a clear picture about why this dramatic change would be happening in the United States.
Ruth, you got a thought?
Well, I just wanted to make the point that we have to look at the mortality, but we also have to look at the incidence and look at the increasing number of new cases. And that was the last time I heard, I think, about 3% a year in Ontario, which hasn't changed for a while. And I think it's battling that statistic that, as a preventionist, I want to see us begin to do.
It's 150,000 people are going to get cancer next year, right? Every year. It's about 150,000 people.
Right. And a lot of them are going to be my kids and your kids and their grandchildren, and what can we do to make sure that that diminishes over time?
Tack Mac.
I think we have to stop blaming the environment. We know 80% of the cancers that can be prevented, we are preventing today. It's very easy to point at the environment because it's an easy target. Nobody understands anything.
You can't blame a former environment minister for wanting to point at the environment.
And you certainly don't think it's an easy target. Nobody's managed to clean the environment up for any reason.
Look, that's a very... See, most of the blame, the environment, came from study that a Japanese woman moving to North America increased their incidence of breast cancer twofold, fourfold, and caught up. But that study was done in Hawaii, right? The incidence of cancers in Hawaii, Australia, where the environment is much better, it's not any different from here in Canada. Just stop blaming the environment.
You think our focus is on the wrong thing?
The focus is just, look, from the basic research point of view, we understood hepatitis B virus, papillomavirus, and now H. pylori. We're going to wipe out, we already have wiped out, liver cancer is coming up, cervical cancer coming up, gastric cancer coming up. Spend more research on things we know rather than they did wrong. Blame them, something in the dark, in the void,
So
environment.
why don't we spend more money on behavior modification research instead of
That I absolutely agree.
science that
I mean-
hasn't yielded substantial results?
Look, Dr. Buckman said it. If you can prevent an 11-year-old girl from smoking, you've done more for preventing cancer than blaming the environment.
Can I just ask you, Beth, do you know how you got cancer the first time around when you were 25 years
No
old?
idea.
And none of your surgeons had any idea, none of your doctors?
Hodgkin's lymphoma, it tends to be a disease of younger and older people, but that's probably as far as you
And the
get.
second time around when you got it again?
Was likely a result of my having been treated with high-dose radiation for the first cancer.
Ruth, is this helping you at all?
Well, I mean, I think we don't often ask the question, how did I get this? When you're diagnosed with it, you want to get better and the cure. And I think that if, as more people are beginning to ask the question, what could have contributed to this? Because I don't think we'll ever know why one person got it and another person didn't. I mean, non-smokers get cancer too. We then begin to push the establishment towards beginning to get some of those answers. But, I mean, that study that Dr. Takmak talks about, yes, that was one study that was done. But we have an international agency for research on cancer that looks at all the chemicals that are out there, or not all of them, but thousands of them, and identifies known to contribute to cancer, likely to contribute to cancer. And we're not taking any action to avoid people being exposed to those substances, whether it be the plastic in the drinking bottles that was highlighted this week, or what's coming out of the smokestacks. And the studies are done with workers in industry, who are the canaries in the mine for many of this, are very explicit about the connection. We will not make that connection as explicitly on a population-wide basis, but until we begin to do, as Massachusetts is doing, for example, California is doing, beginning to find substitutes for the carcinogens that we use, I don't believe we'll reduce the incidence.
Rob Buckman.
I think that's a deep hole. The environment. I agree with Tak, actually, that the environment is an easy target in the sense that it's an easy way to get rid of money. You could spend. There are lots. There are so many millions of carcinogens that could cause cancer in the test tube, as it were. But whether they actually have any relevance to human beings is probably not where I'd put my money at the moment. And actually, Beth is a very good example. Hodgkin's disease, a relatively rare kind of cancer of the lymphoid cells, and people have looked for 40 years to find pockets of cancers of Hodgkin's. I mean, specifically. Oh, there was one class in Harvard, I think in the 1960s. There's a virus, and they looked for pockets everywhere else, and nothing.
Can't find anything.
We can't find any. But in some respects, Beth is always good evidence that we don't need it, particularly because we've actually got a very high cure rate in Hodgkin's disease, as we have in testicular cancers and a few others.
Terry.
So I wouldn't put a lot of money in there.
Well, we do have examples, historical examples of cancers that are tied in particular to the occupational environment. Small concentrated groups. This year, probably 150 people in Ontario will get lung cancer from asbestos exposure. They will die of a disease that's tied to asbestos. The pathway to that prevention is regulation. And the pathway to most of the environmental exposures is regulation. And that tends to be an act of citizenry informed by science, but it's not the same as the science.
Let me put a number up here, because
Yeah.
I enjoyed watching you all argue about this in the green room ahead of time as to whether we've got this number right. But I think it's off your website. So here we go. Blame it on lifestyle. Unhealthy eating, physical inactivity, and obesity may contribute to about 50% of cancer deaths in developed countries. That's off Cancer Care Ontario's website. Anybody want to dispute that 50%? That's a lot. That sounds like a lot, and it sounds like, therefore, a lot of this is preventable. Michael, is that fair to say?
Well, that 50%, and if that's from Cancer Care Ontario's website, I can't speak to it, but that 50% includes other preventable things like tobacco and so on. So, yes, I think that our current basic thinking is that at least 50% of cancers can be prevented. That's on a population level basis, not on an individual basis necessarily.
Tak, you're not. I sense you're not sold on that.
No, I think 20, 30%. I think in developing countries, it's 50% because of liver cancer,
Infectious
stomach
process.
cancers that are due to infections. But I think here in Canada, I would say 20, maybe 30% are preventable.
Are preventable.
And
And the
it would be
rest is what?
cigarettes, alcohol, sunshine.
And the rest is genetic? Nothing we can do it? We picked our parents badly? That kind of thing?
You're ruling out physical activity and obesity?
Well, I think that is the side effect. I agree that would contribute to it. But I think one thing we never mentioned so far is because we're living longer.
Right.
And we're living longer, we're getting more cancers. Because we're not dying of cardiovascular diseases because of statins and, controlling our blood pressure.
Sure, but that doesn't speak to Beth's situation, I don't know how old you are, but you've had cancer twice already in your life at a very young age, right? That doesn't speak to her situation.
But
Well-
still, if you're talking about population, it's really hard to take a case like mine as a typical example. We've actually made a huge amount of progress on childhood cancers. So now we have a whole second generation of survivors who are at a very high risk for secondary cancers because of their treatment. But you can never just take something in
Okay,
isolation
but do
like that,
you-
because everybody in this room thinks about cancer as a population-based problem, not as an anecdote.
But do you presume that your cancer is genetically based?
I presume nothing about it.
You don't presume that?
It's a confounding question that I won't be able to. I'm kind of indoctrinated in an evidence-based model now, so nobody will ever give me that information. And as a survivor, you kind of cope by saying, no, I have a life, and the important thing is that I live it fully, and I do everything within my power to mitigate risk. I exercise, I moderate my alcohol consumption, I exercise like crazy, and so all of the things that I can control, I do control.
That leads actually very nicely to a story that has been all over the news in the last couple of weeks and has really been, I mean, it's really one of the very sad cancer stories going on out there, and I'm talking about Elizabeth Edwards, whose husband, John Edwards, of course, is running for the presidency again for the Democratic nomination, and she has said that rather than kind of stay home and treat her cancer in that more traditional way, she is, damn it all, going to get out there on the hustings with her husband and spend whatever time she's got left trying to make him the president of the United States. Rob Buckman, can you really do that?
Absolutely. If I was the Edwards' doctor, I would say exactly that.
How long does she have to live?
Very, very important point, and this is a sort of poster child. That if breast cancer spreads to bones, which it commonly does, it likes to do that, as it were, has a predilection for that. In fact, it very often runs slowly. It is incurable. It is not curable once it has spread to bones, just as Mrs. Edwards has been told, But it very often runs slowly, and control of that can go on for years and years and years. In fact, there's a Princess Margaret talking now. One of the things that we're very interested in is breast cancer that spreads only to bones, because that's actually so difficult to measure that it's not included in many clinical trials. And we've got a clinical trial just about to start in which we're looking at exactly patients like Mrs. Edwards. And I would say to her, if I was your doctor, absolutely, do it, girl, go for it. You're not going to, staying at home is absolutely valueless. There's no value in that at all. You're almost certainly not going to die in the next year or 2 years or maybe 3. On an average, if it's bone only, there was one paper a few years ago that showed the average survival was 5 years. And that was before many of the hormone agents had actually been perfected that we now do. I would absolutely say, Mrs. Edwards, what you have is a chronic disease. Mr. Edwards, if you get to be President of the United States, I'm terribly sorry, at the best you won't be President for longer than 8 years. That's a self-limited condition. Mrs. Edwards, you have a really good chance. Go for it, girl, and do exactly what you said.
Michael.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that, and the idea of perhaps chronic is not the word I would use, but more manageable. And for example, my dad, before he died, was diagnosed many years ago as an insulin-dependent diabetic. And when that happened, we weren't very happy about it. But there was no gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands and saying, oh, darn, Dad's going to die. What are we going to do about it?
There is on this story.
Well, there is, because of the fear that cancer word provokes. And Rob can tell you about experiments he's done with audiences where just that word cancer associated with something just evokes fear in people. And I know that one of the visions of the Canadian Cancer Society is to create a world where no Canadian fears cancer. I think increasingly we are getting to that point, the tipping point, as Tat talked about, where in fact someone getting a cancer diagnosis isn't going to be happy about it, but their reaction isn't going to be, I'm going to die. Their reaction is going to be, okay, well, how do we manage this? How do we move forward with it? And how do I maintain a reasonably normal lifestyle and a length of life?
Well, this is it. I mean, when you're running for president, there's no such thing as a relatively normal lifestyle. She's going to be on planes, trains, automobiles, going from coast to coast to coast. She's got 2 little kids, already. This is where I want to ask you about this, Beth. I mean, she has been, some people have criticized her. And the Edwards family, for those who don't know, they've been to hell and back. They've lost a child already through a car accident. This is what, I don't know, the 2nd recurrence of her cancer. So, I mean, they've really been through it. What do you think about the criticism that says she's got 2 little kids, she ought to be staying closer to them, forget the presidential campaign? We're not saying cancer is going to be the boss of her, but, I mean, come on. That's the criticism.
Well, you still have to live your life according to your own values and your own ambitions. And just because you may have a different window of life doesn't mean that you don't have to still fulfill whatever destiny you feel you have.
So you support her?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Ruth,
I mean,
what do you think?
why would you go to bed? What are you going to accomplish? Our system has improved so much in terms of supporting people. I mean, Lance Armstrong has done so much for that idea of survivorship, that it's not a death sentence, or even if you're dying, you're still living while you're dying. So the whole advent of kind of more humane models of palliative care, a much more supportive network of psychosocial professionals to help you deal with those hard emotional issues that everybody faces. When I was first diagnosed, there were barely social workers around. This time around, I had support groups, I had a lot of psychosocial help. So the level of support has improved tremendously.
You still think of yourself as a cancer survivor?
Absolutely.
You do?
Yeah.
Those two words are going to be beside you wherever you go, whenever you go.
But
right?
there's a lot of other words there too, and you have, you know.
Thrivers. Now, Rob and I have been, cancer thrivers.
Yes, cancer thriver.
Ruth, you wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted to, I agree with Beth, and I think the point is that people have to make their own choices, and they have to be given the information that enables them to make the right choice for them, and to be sure that whatever choice they make, there is a system there to support them. And I think we've got some way to go in making that universal. I mean, we're in Toronto, where there's an awful lot of support and a lot of acknowledgement of that, and I'm not sure that our system is able to do that all across. And that's, again, one of my worries back to the national strategy, that on the front lines of the kind of support and care, and as well as the kind of prevention that I advocate, are public health departments and local authorities. And somehow the cancer budget doesn't necessarily trickle down to them, and they're a very important component at both ends of the continuum in cancer.
Rob, I guess part of the criticism about Elizabeth Edwards' decision was that, you're right, she may have years, she may have 6 months. Is this the best way to spend the last 6 months of her life? Should she, should she be doing what she's been doing?
It's up to her.
Absolutely up to her, thank you. Absolutely up to her. And secondly, the chance of her dying of her cancer in the next 6 months, we have to say this publicly, is very small. As somebody once said, they say to Mrs. Edwards, you are going to die. There is no doubt every single human being on this planet is going to die. And there is no particular reason to argue with her about what she does in the next few years than there is with anybody else. I mean, I wouldn't turn to Ruth and say, you're going to die. You're probably not going to live more than another 50 years from now, probably. Forgive me for being presumptuous. Exactly. Here's what you should do.
But will prevention be a priority in the next 50 years?
Not with the guy I'm about to ask the question of. What has changed in the way cancer is being treated that allows cancer patients to live a lot longer today than they perhaps ever have?
Well, take breast cancer, for example. We have now this drug for Herceptin, developed by Dennis Slayman, one of our collaborators. And it affects about 25% of the breast cancer, but they're the very aggressive young women type. Lo and behold, this drug, which is not would consider as really, really toxic, is saving lives. Some women early in the disease would have died. With this drug, they are cured. I use the word.
I was just going to say, can you use the word cured?
Mathematically, if you look at the statistics, it does look like they're cured. Yeah. Okay. So I think there's one more thing I wanted to say, that I think cancer is as good as it's going to be if we don't start looking at how to make it better. I think the incidence is going up because of cardiovascular disease going down, deaths due to it, and our lifestyle. A lot of the women breast cancer going up is because, my grandmother had her first child at 16. Mm-hmm. A lot of women now having the first child at 35, 40.
Or 40, right.
That increased the risk of breast cancer big time. Now that's just a choice.
This is a huge cultural shift you're asking people to make, which is basically have your babies earlier. I mean, that's part of what you're saying.
I'm telling you the fact.
You're telling us the fact.
One kind of cancer and one issue, I think that.
It does have its own hazards. Having children at 16, like your grandmother, we have known for many, many decades that is one way of decreasing your incidence of breast cancer. But I personally would support, just as Tak is saying, the Herceptin kind of approach is a better approach than having children at 16. generally.
The Herceptin actually brings up a really, what I see as one of the big conundrums that we face in cancer care, which is the escalating cost of targeted cancer drugs. And when we see an increase in incidence of 3% per year, compounded by the fact that we've got very expensive targeted therapies and limited budgets, you see the lines kind of colliding off in space somewhere and heading for a really, really problematic kind of ethical difficulty in saying, like, how are we going to care for our society? We know that incidence is going up, and we know that costs are going to go up at the same time.
This is one of the things I wanted to ask Terry, because it's true. I mean, it's hard to pick up the paper any day of the week without reading some story about cancer and about how there's absolutely, as our society ages and so on and so forth, we're all going to get it, and our healthcare system is not nearly going to be able to handle it in terms of resource management and so on. That's something that's on your desk every day. How are we doing on that?
Well, the whole story about cancer as more of a chronic illness, if you like, for at least some cancers, that's a challenge that all of us have to deal with. So drugs, I'll come back to drugs in a moment, but the whole issue about how we organize care now for cancer patients, we have to rethink, particularly for those that have diseases that recur over decades, essentially. So we have to think carefully about what's the role of specialty care, what's the role of primary care, how do we link electronically. We have a very primitive primary care system in Canada. We're at the bottom of the list of the G7 countries with respect to the capacity for primary care to work with prompts, reminders, callbacks, all these things at the front end of the continuum that are necessary to deal with the problem. So we do have to think, how are we going to reconfigure our resources? Herceptin, 25% of women, maybe at the up end, will respond to this, and this is a tremendous breakthrough. It's a very expensive drug. Bear in mind, we still have a large fraction of women in the early stage of breast cancer that will not have the benefit of Herceptin. So we need to have a set of principled, transparent rules by which we make judgments informed by ethical principles that say, from the public purse, this is what we will agree to as a threshold. And this typically gets expressed in what people have difficulty accepting as a cost-effective.
Just curious, what is the cost per regimen or per treatment?
Of Herceptin?
Yeah.
It depends on the individual, but it's probably in the order of $30,000 to $40,000.
Ouch. Ruth?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Terry said, but let me come back to my single tune, which is that we spend less than 1% of the cancer budget on prevention. And so as we look at what is going to be incredible costs and the emotional difficulty of wrestling with those decisions and those costs, I know something about as a minister, unless we make some investment at the front end, it's going to be never ending.
Last word to Rob Buckman.
Could I persuade Ruth not to spend money in research in prevention, but implementation in prevention?
Absolutely. Please.
Could I persuade you? Yeah.
No need to persuade
Okay,
me.
good.
Just get on with it.
Let's absolutely get on with that.
That sounds like a good place to leave it. I want to thank everybody for coming in tonight and conducting this discussion in such a civilized manner. I know how much you all, on some issues, disagree on this one, but it was great to have you all here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.